Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the session of using DevOps and Copilot to simplify and accelerate development of AI apps. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to review our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be trying to answer questions or drop links, and we'll have time for questions throughout the session. Our session is recorded. It'll be available to view on demand in 24 to 48 hours, which brings us to today. I'll turn it over to Amy for introductions.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session using DevOps and Copilot to simplify and accelerate development of AI apps. My name's Amy Boyd. I'm a principal cloud advocate here at Microsoft, specializing in AI. But more importantly, who am I joined by? So I am joined by Armon Dadgar, who is Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of HashiCorp. So welcome, Armon. And also we have the wonderful Nabila Babar, who is a principal PM Manager here of our Azure AI platform at Microsoft. So welcome, Nabila. Good to have you both.
Thanks so much, Amy. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover in this session. I feel like a real top of mind topic where we're going to kind of talk about the intersection of two technologies. I feel like that is happening everywhere at the moment. AI is being talked about a lot, but actually bringing this stuff to production, I feel like is being spoken about so much quicker in this trend than in the past. So let's get started and break down just a few things so that we're all on the same page with our audience. So first things first, Nabila, can you just give us like executive summary, 1,000 feet high view of generative AI and what kind of changed in 2023?
Awesome. I'd love to. Happy Tuesday. So when we start talking about generative AI, I'll step back a little bit and I'll first talk about traditional machine learning. So traditional machine learning systems are really good at making predictions or decisions based on existing data. But generative AI goes a step further. Generative AI uses pre-trained models, and it not only predicts, but it also creates or generates entirely new content. And this content is based on the data that the model has been pre-trained on. And the advancements in generative AI really are fueled by three main things. The first one is advancement in deep learning. The second is abundance of data that we have today. And the third one is the increased computational power of training these large models known as LLMs. You may hear large language models, open models, generative AI models. All of these terms are used. And the way the LLMs work, it's actually pretty simple. LLMs predict the next token or word in a sequence, and it's based on a fixed set of tokens and words. And this isn't just limited to text. It can support various kinds of content across speech, images, or even videos.
That was like the most perfect explanation. We should just take that as a snippet. That's going on TikTok. What a win. So thank you so much for that, Nabila. So level set, generative AI, it sits with those LLM models. We're adding data to it, and it's able to be creative and generate different things, generative. So Armon, on your side of the house, where we're talking about DevOps, infrastructure, production, stuff like that, what's going on? What's the temperament at the moment around the AI space in your area?
I'd say people are super excited. I think one of the interesting things is over the last, I'll call it 10 years, has been this shift away from very traditional approaches to infrastructure management, right? Pointing and clicking, manually configuring things, deploying it in, consoles or through CLIs, to much more modern techniques, things like infrastructure as code, really being able to do automation. I think the challenge that brought, though, was sort of two things. One is it required a pretty deep skill set and expertise. And so I think, there's a set of folks that have that who have spent the last 10 years really becoming proficient in this. But I think there's a much, much bigger pool of people who want to do cloud infrastructure, but maybe aren't at that level of expertise. So I think there's one side of this where a lot of people are excited about, okay, does this enable another class, or the next level of, users to really come in and be able to leverage these things without having to go spend years becoming expert in it? I think that's one interesting opportunity. I think the second challenge is, well, we've spent 10 years building all of these systems using these tools. But now there's a huge amount of things like infrastructure as code and automation code out there that now we have to manage and maintain. So I think when we look at the implication of that, it's, can you use generative AI to enable this stuff to be done more easily with less expertise required? But at the same time, can you make it easier to manage these at scale large environments where you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines of automation code basically for them? And can generative AI make that more manageable by helping you automatically patch it, automatically looking for misconfigurations, help you do version upgrades, things like that? So I think there's a ton of excitement out there in terms of how might this stuff, help evolve what we're doing in infrastructure.
Oh no, love that kind of insight on. Yeah, I almost feel like there's two parts, isn't there? There's kind of how can AI help with the day-to-day of DevOps and infrastructure as code and stuff like that, and then there's the piece of when we're pushing AI apps into production, is there different things that we need to do to manage these large language models? Is it any different from machine learning? That's I don't want to be the unpopular opinion, but that's what some people say. And so it's an interesting thing to see those two sides, but it's nice to see people so positive about bringing it. How can it help me, right? Like, how can it make my day quicker? How can I do more with my time? And hopefully some of those tasks that we don't always like doing, right, that become a bit menial.
Right. Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah. I think you're right. I forgot to mention that side of it, which is, I was thinking about sort of the impact of Gen AI on broader infrastructure management, but you're right. More specifically, it's even how do I apply things like infrastructure management to setting up language, both training environments, serving stacks, all of that stuff. So there's certainly a large impact there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say it's the two sides for me. This talk was most exciting because I was like, I feel like these two technologies can help each other so much. Like it's an absolute core to getting these things into real life. And actually, Nabila, if I can come back to you, what does real life look like right now for generative AI? So are you seeing are people putting it into production? Like, is that a question I can ask her? And then Armon will come to you afterwards for your examples also.
Great question. So it's funny, a few months ago, maybe we would all hear that there's a hype of AI. I don't think it's a hype. It's not going away. It's here. I think I'm seeing folks leaning into it and making it our own. But today, I think where we stand, the technology and the tooling is evolving really fast. You'll see a wide spectrum of it being used in the market as well. Anything from playground demos to all the way to powerful capabilities from OpenAI, Microsoft with their copilots and assistants and so on. So you're seeing a wide range of spectrum. The question isn't if I should adopt it. The question really is, how do I adopt it? How do I get started? What are the limitations and strengths of these tools that are available to me? What are the problems it can solve for me? And then also, this isn't something that's new for developers. With any advancement in technology, this is something that comes up. The world that we live in today is different than 50 to 100 years ago, right? And it will continue to have more and more abstractions. This is just a new abstraction. I think we have to make it our own, and then it will make some things easier, but it will also introduce a lot of new opportunities and challenges as well.
I appreciate it. No, it's a good insight. I like the not do I want to do it. It's like, okay, how do I do it? And so hopefully, we'll get to that a little bit further down as well out of this talk. Like, everyone wants that action. Like, what can I do today? I want to do it tomorrow. I want to do it right now. So, Armon, in your part of the business around, at HashiCorp, what are you seeing with your customers? You said people are leaning in. What types of things are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Nabila's point, I think we see a whole broad range. I think there's people who are, as she said, just dipping toes in, and they're like, hey, help me set up a sandbox and understand how I can play with it and understand the impact. And we do see people who are in full-blown, production mode, right? So I think it is a broad spectrum. I'd say my sense is most of the market is probably closer to the sandbox. Just because I think this stuff is very complicated. It's new. The skill sets aren't broadly, well known and understood. But I do think you have early movers and early adopters that are, certainly the high techs tend to be more, further progressed. And I think there's a whole set of startups, I think, interestingly, that were born on the premise of some of this stuff. So I think that's where you see this interesting tale of kind of two cities a little bit, is there's a whole kind of next generation set of these startups that are, their sort of core innovation is how do we apply some of these LLMs and Gen AI techniques to maybe traditional business problems that, weren't enabled through that. So I think it's going to be interesting, and it's going to be, do some of these incumbents sort of adopt the technology organically, or do they just acquire, some of these startups as they get to some level of maturity? So it's going to be interesting to see how the market evolves.
Yeah, I was actually chatting to someone on our team the other day about that. That was like, as with any new technology, comes the opportunities for startups to sounds really bad, push the boundaries of what's possible, or plug the gaps. A lot of tooling tends to come out at this kind of time, doesn't it? That says hey, that's super difficult. Let me make it easier for you. I feel like is a good one as well. So I'm sure, we'll see lots of that in both these tech areas. So with that, we spoke when we got together previously to this a little bit about that adoption. So people are trying it out. What are we hearing? Oh, barriers is such a negative word, but it is a little bit. Why are people hesitant to jump straight into production? And so, Nabila, you brought up this idea of getting started with AI using 4 pillars. I think you mentioned, was it learning, evaluation, getting AI to do what you want, and then safety as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about those different pillars?
It's really interesting. Earlier we were saying, hey, we have this wide spectrum of folks getting started, all the way to folks that are in production. And when I get asked what are the top barriers to adopting generative AI today, it's actually a journey and 4 different stages across these. So I'll start with the first one, which is learning. That is one, the lack of guidance for building solutions. There are many tools out there, as we said earlier, and the difficulty really comes, and again, this isn't new, but the difficulty comes in plugging them all together and making them work. We have access to different toolings. Plugging them together is always hard, and AI is no exception to that. And then the next phase is, okay, I have all these options now, right? And tooling, then how do I evaluate the impact of those on my application? So the second barrier is evaluation. There are many variables, whether you're using different models, whether they're Azure OpenAI models, Meta, models from Microsoft Research. These are all different variables you can use. There are different parameters. You can have many different prompts. And then data sources as well. You may have to connect to many different data sources. So how do you evaluate the impact of all of these variables on your application? The third one, then, in the next stage, is how do I get this to do what I want it to do? Now I know where all the gaps are in here. I need to get this to do what I want it to do. An example of this is one of the major issues that we see with generative AI is that when you take a prompt and generate something, it produces something that we call a hallucination. And that's just another way of saying that it's not correct. And you'll see this often when you start seeing it become very verbose. Or in images, if you have an image that's very far away, you may see hallucinations. So then that is the next challenge, is how do you overcome those and get it to do what you want it to do? And the last one is concerns for data privacy and, of course, security as well.
That's brilliant. And Armon, what are you hearing from customers about these areas? Where are they falling between the gaps? What are you seeing from your kind of perspective?
Oh boy, probably people are struggling, I think, with all of those. I think on the early part of the spectrum, there is a tool explosion at the moment, which does make it hard. I mean, it's I think you almost need a database to keep track of all the vector databases that are available. So it's I think the challenge is people who are getting started are hey, what is a vector database? Why do I need one? Okay, there's 25 of them. Which of them should I use? There's different. So I think with every one of these things, and to Nabila's point, they all make a big difference. It's well, what vector encoding you use will change how you interact with some of these things. And so I think that's part of the challenge today is it's just the learning of some of this stuff and understanding what the tool sets, skill sets are that are needed to play with it. And then I do think getting the model to do what you want is very hard, right? We've done a bunch of work already in sort of Terraform land. And the way I put it is often these models will be confidently wrong, right? They're always going to generate an output. No matter what you ask them, they'll generate an output. Whether that output has any bearing on anything is a different question. And I think what we found is that there's an incredible amount of sensitivity to the training data, the reinforcement you do, the prompting you do. So there's a lot of guardrails you have to put on to really make sure that you can get the model accurate. And small tweaks can take something from 30% accuracy to 50% to 70%. So there's these huge jumps with very tiny changes. So it's like they're relatively sensitive in that sense, right? They're not hyper robust where I can change a bunch of input and it only changes the output by 1 degree. They're very sensitive in that sense. So, I think that's the hard part. And I think, I think the way Nabila phrased it as phases is right. You kind of have to go through each of them as phases. It's almost a maturity curve, right? Like unless you've solved kind of phase 1 and 2, you can't really get to 3 and 4. And I think those are the hard parts. I do think we're going to get better at it. And I think, the industry is evolving so quickly that it's like the thing that was best practice 6 months ago is sort of like old news today. So I do think that's just honestly makes it a little bit hard, and frankly, I can see why some people getting into it now would be a little frustrated. It's like, oh, you read that blog post from 6 months ago? It's like, oh, just shred it, It's like, which is annoying, right? Because like it doesn't seem like it's that long ago, but that's the kind of the state of the industry at the moment.
Oh, don't you are talking to someone whose literal job is working on like content and learning and skilling. Everything's out of date all the time. Like it's like we're back in the book era, like print the book and it's out of date sort of thing. So it's I totally hear you on that. That's a big one. And I guess there is this element as well, isn't there, of people, how easily they can get almost like it's like any technology. What's the low hanging fruit? What's the bits where we can easily apply it? So, oh man, I bet loads of people are doing code generation with infrastructure as code, like with different copilots. Or I was chatting with Liam Hampton on my team. He does lots in this space. He's written some brilliant blog posts recently on this, and he was like, well, actually, there's stuff you can do around unit tests. There's stuff that you can do around all different pieces. But the key part of it is like you're always in the loop, and so those low-hanging pieces that you can quickly try out are actually make you more comfortable, I think, with the technology. And you, as you said, you get to know how to prompt it, how it responds, when to just go, no, that's not what I needed. Do you know what I mean? And then like move on. So yeah, are they some of the areas? Are there other areas that you're seeing people do fun things with? When they're actually building like infrastructure as code?
Yeah, I think the way you put it is right, which is I think certainly the way we're prioritizing it, and I think the way I've seen other people prioritizing it is you sort of look at it as like, where can it add value but minimize its ability to break things? So I think things like unit tests is a great example because it's like it can add value, it's saving developer toil. But a unit test can really add a logic bug into your application. Like at worst, it can be a crappy test, but it's not going to break the application, right? So it's a relatively low risk way to start. And I think even if I look at where we started with Terraform, we tried a bunch of different areas. The piece that was in production today is automatic test generation for Terraform. So it's exactly that. So you can basically give it a module and say, hey, automatically generate for me a unit test effectively for this. Because as we played with it, we're like, hey, this is relatively low risk. Even if it hallucinates, I think in our experimentation, we've got it up to maybe I'd consider it 80-ish% accuracy. You're like, okay, that's pretty good. It's good enough that it reduces toil. It adds value to the developer. And that 20% of the time where it's wrong, they can easily fix it without it breaking anything in their app. Versus I think if you get something 80% right in the code generation of infrastructure, that last 20% could be significant, right? Like if it's a security vulnerability or it causes your cost to massively blow up or something like that. Like, 20% wrong can be significant. So, I think that's where it's like you gotta kind of fine tune how these models get used. And I think that's where we see a lot of people looking at it as places where it's human in the loop. It's you're looking at things where it's relatively low risk. Or it's an expert system and you're helping an expert who's going to catch something that's fairly obvious if it's wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think like what are people using generative AI for like day to day? They're like helping them craft emails, or they're helping, but it's like helping them, right? Like they're always the one that's in control of the send button, for example, right. And like, on your head, be it if someone knows that Copilot's written that as well, that's because you've not gone through it. But it's also one of these exciting pieces where, as you said, it just saves you so much time. And I know developers are seeing so much great like progress that they can focus on the difficult problems, right. Or bringing us back to that kind of like learning and skilling piece. One of the interesting things I found when using like generative AI in the coding environment is like if I don't know something, I'd normally have to go to a web browser, search a few different things, land on a few very popular websites around this kind of stuff. actually you can just ask that kind of thing, right? Like, what is the function in Python to do this or something like that? And I don't know how much like value it adds to my life to have to go and do the browsing. And so actually having it just do that for me, you just, I don't know, why does it make you feel so powerful, right? Like you're getting stuff done and you're kind of moving on, and yeah, you'll be able to spend the time on that complex piece of it. That brings us nicely to accelerate into market. So a good example there, it accelerated me to be better at Python. But on the other side of things, how do we think we're accelerating time to market for AI use cases or just applications in general? Armon, let's start with you. Nabila, we'll come to you afterwards if possible.
Sure, yeah. I think there's a few different things happening, right? Which is, one is I think consuming these things as a cloud service is actually making it a lot easier. I think historically, when you think about a lot of the innovations that have happened, a lot of companies have wanted to there's sort of a natural tendency, especially among bigger enterprises, to self-host some of this stuff. I think people are realizing, given the sheer compute requirements, it's like that's kind of impossible. And you just sort of have to consume this as a cloud service. So I do think that actually has this weird effect of it's actually just helping accelerate the time to market of these things, because people are starting from the premise of like, I have to build it in cloud. And so I'm going to build it in sort of a cloud native way using some of these serving stacks and some of the available service APIs, treat it like a SaaS service. So I think that's helping. I think certainly a lot of it is being built with things like infrastructure as code, right? So it's like, how do we actually automate the delivery and building of some of these things? Actually, fun point of pride for us is that OpenAI was a very early adopter of Terraform and basically built a lot of their infrastructure with it. So, we got to play a very small role in enabling some of this stuff. So I think for us, it's like we look at it and say, okay, how are you actually leveraging some of the latest infrastructure tools to stand up these applications? I think that's a piece of it. But then two is building upon cloud, right? And getting to leverage the kind of existing service portfolios that exist. I think that's a key part of it as well. And that's
really cool.
Nabila.
Yeah, no, definitely. As I say, Nabila, so the cloud, that's where you live, right? Like that's your focus of the world. Tell us a bit more about what we're doing in that space to accelerate people with these AI projects.
Sure. So first, I love how the two of you summed it in terms of the sweet spot for any developer is really finding the things that I don't want to do compared to the things that like the technology is really good at. It's like a Venn diagram, right? So you have to look at both of those. What are the things that I can automate that are tedious that I don't want to do? And we see this common. Like we talked a lot about code generation. But what's great about generative AI, it's the application of it is pretty broad across a lot of industries, from retail to healthcare to manufacturing, and then across different tasks as well, whether it's code generation in technology, or it is a chatbot in retail, or it is content creation where you're a lot more creative. So it's really finding the sweet spot of what you don't want to do or is tedious, and the things that the technology is really good at. And the other thing I'm seeing a lot in the industry also is teams being formed that are kind of Gen AI core teams, platform teams within organizations. So you'll see this is a common pattern as well. And this is great also because it enables folks to both share learnings, but it also enables you to have certain checks and balances and common practices in place to help you be successful. At Microsoft, one of the things that we're doing is at Ignite, we released Azure AI Studio. And the goal of Azure AI Studio is to give our customers the same capabilities, tooling, models that we have access to internally to build copilots to you. So for example, AI Studio has both a wide set of models, thousands of models from Meta to Microsoft Research to OpenAI models, as well as tooling, and then of course an enterprise-grade platform as well. So we're kind of giving you all of those pieces, whether you want to fine-tune, you need to fine-tune to introduce bias into your application, or you need to have a RAG pattern to ground your model with your data. We're kind of bringing all of those learnings to third-party and to our customers to be able to learn from what we're doing internally.
I love that. No, so yeah, the end to end, isn't it, in some senses of what do we need in all these different places, and AI Studio is always evolving. I'm sure there's lots to come there, and so it's great to see, that you see customers from all different industries, even though, developers tend to be the first ones to pick it up, right? Some of the cool tech, actually, it's great to see that everyone's coming on that journey. It's not just that sort of developer sector as well. Armon, tell us more. Infrastructure as code. Where do we expect the market to go? And because we have you specifically, any Terraform roadmap, maybe stuff you could share?
Yeah, sure. I think my sense of it is I think there's going to be a few different angles where I think Gen AI will get leverage, right? I think one that we've already talked about, it's pretty, I think, straightforward, is the generation of code. I think that one today is already being used pretty broadly. I know we announced some work alongside, GitHub and Microsoft on training Copilot with Terraform. So I think that's already happening. And I think it's only going to get better over time in terms of less hallucinations, more sort of context awareness. So I think that gets richer. I think some of the pieces, and I think Nabila used the phrase RAG, which is sort of it's basically how do we augment these generations to not just be, I'll call it sort of generic in some sense, right? Like it's generically trained on, the same corpus of data. So it doesn't matter which user is using it, you might get the same answer. Versus I think with RAG, what you can start to do is basically augment it based on who the user is in the context. So good examples of this would be, hey, if I'm an employee of HashiCorp and I say, hey, generate Terraform for me that has, how do I deploy my Java app? I might have an internal module for doing Java apps at HashiCorp. And so I actually want the generated code to leverage my internal module rather than just a generic Java implementation that's trained from public data. Versus if I'm a customer at, say, I don't know, ABC Bank, then they might have a different module for how they deploy a Java app. So in that sense, I'm going to use techniques like RAG to basically say, hey, based on the user and the environment they're in and what modules are available for that organization, maybe the response is actually customized. So it's not just a generic Java module. Even though the prompt might be exactly the same, the outputs should be different and contextual based on what the user is doing. So I think that's where things like code generation go over time, is they should become much more contextual and aware of what's your environment, what's your context, what company do you work for, what are the policies, what services are you allowed to use, what versions of Java. So I think all of those become kind of organizational inputs that you can then augment and bias the models effectively to generate something that's more unique and more appropriate to whatever your environment is. So that's, I think, there'll be a deepening in terms of the levels of sophistication, even though it sounds simple. It's like in both cases, it's just generation. But there's a lot that goes into like, how do you make it, more appropriate? Then I think on the other side goes to my view on, I'll call it sort of synthesis of these environments, right? I think these models are, even though they're generative models, they're actually quite good at summarization and synthesis as well, right? So what I want to be able to say is like, great, I'm at, HashiCorp, or I'm at ABC Bank, I'm a new employee. I don't understand this infrastructure because I just joined. There's hundreds of thousands of lines of configuration. I could sit here and read all of that. I don't want to. I'd rather say, hey, can it summarize this for me? Explain this to me. And it says, okay, you have a VPC design, and here's the different modules, and you're running Java and C# and whatever. So I'd like to be able to do both sides of that, because it becomes an operator tool to accelerate understanding of these environments, as well as can I do that sort of summarization. And then I think there's a bunch of these sort of ancillary workflows around, like we talked about, like test case generation is a good example of, hey, I have this Terraform module, write a test case for me. So some of that's already in production, right? So you can do the test case generation. You can ask it today to generate code for you with copilots and things like that. So I think it's about iteratively, basically refining these things, bringing the RAGs in, bringing more context, making it more environmentally specific. And I think that's how you're going to make this stuff more, I'll call it nuanced and mature over time. Like, I don't think it's a binary of like, has Gen AI, doesn't have Gen AI. I think like all things, you have to go on a maturity curve with these things that they get deeper and richer in terms of capability.
Yeah, so many great examples there that I'm sure a lot of our viewers on a day-to-day basis are kind of, working on, summarizing the code base. Oh my goodness, yes. Like, and it's saying, so you could like apply that, right, to pull requests or anything as well, right? Like you're asked to review a pull request where like it literally says at the top, like 500 files have been changed. And you're like, oh gosh, and how long am I going to be sitting here doing this? I have 10 minutes till my next meeting, sort of thing. And there's a little bit of stress going on. So yeah, no, I can see how that would be, alleviate some of that and say, hey, like, summarize for me, what are the changes that are being made? But then obviously, again, you're still in control. You're the developer. You're the one that's been assigned to the pull request, but it's helping you along to find what are the key things from that that pull request you might need to do. So love that. Can see how that kind of all fits together. Again, I don't want to take our barriers sort of section to like a negative space, but is there any mistakes either of you are seeing that we don't want our audience to go and do? Is there anything in, I don't know, how they're planning or how they're managing afterwards as well, right? The success we get to this to production, and then like we can't just ignore it. Got to keep looking after it in some senses. Either of you want to jump in on that question?
Nabila, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm not sure. I don't know about kind of major mistakes that I'm seeing. I think in general, I hear a lot of, anytime I tell someone, hey, like this is the field we're in, I'll hear a little bit of fear, right? Is this going to take over my job? It's not really a mistake. I think it's just a fear of like, hey, like how do I wrap my head around this thing? How do I make it kind of my own? I think that's just one fear I see. And I think the best way to overcome that is folks just leaning in, starting simple. It can be even as simple as I'm going to use this model in some kind of playground, and I'm slowly going to add more complexity to it over time. So for example, I'm going to start by one simple example, which is I'm just going to use this model to see what kind of information it's giving me or it's generating. And then you'll very quickly, Armon said this earlier, you'll very quickly realize that, hey, this trick was trained on data from like XYZ date. It doesn't have access to the data that I wanted to have access to. And the next step is, hey, like how do I give it access to data that I'm seeing? So that's just one level of complexity you add. From that, you can use a RAG pattern, let's say, and then you add that. And then you're like, okay, now it has access to the data that I wanted to have access to, but it's still not giving me the right output. Then what is the temperature I'm using? What is the prompt I'm using? Again, you add another level of complexity, and then you start playing with the different prompts. From there, then you might go from a single like task to saying, hey, I want this not just to be able to have access to one data set, but maybe multiple data sets. Again, you add another level of complexity to that. From there, maybe I wanted to do multiple tasks. I wanted to summarize, but then I also wanted to create a ticket or submit or take some kind of action. So you might add that complexity. So the way I think, and the way I would see it is kind of starting very small and slowly adding complexity, and then seeing what is the impact of that on your overall application, and then having tooling in place to be able to measure that. That's the kind of the best practice or the best way I'm seeing getting involved. But I don't know if there are any like big like no-nos I can say. I think we've covered it earlier by saying, hey, start with the things that you don't want to do anymore, where the things that AI is really good at, and the things that you're willing to have some level of risk and checks and balances in. I think that the other thing to keep in mind is with this, you're always in control of two things that's really important. One is you're in control of the data that it has access to, right? As a developer, you control that. And the second is that you're also in control of the decisions or the actions it makes. So those are two things I would keep in mind. With those, I think leaning in and thinking about what this can do for you and how do you slowly build up that skill set would be my recommendation.
Nice. See, Armon, AI is just like inheriting the DevOps cycle, right? Agile development, iterative development. So if anything, these two should have always been friends, AI and DevOps. But passing over to you, any mistakes, things you've seen people go, oh, we do that differently in our next iteration, sort of thing?
Yeah, maybe a few things actually I'd say is, I think one of the things that these models do really well is they retain enormous amounts of data. That can be a double-edged blade, right? So I've seen people basically train it on data that's not anonymized or not appropriately sort of tokenized, and assume that, oh, well, once it gets sort of like, trained through the model, like it will be sort of anonymized through that training process, or like it gets incorporated. And then the problem is with the right types of sort of prompts, you can get the models to basically spit back their training data almost verbatim. And so we've seen that in a number of cases where it can end up exposing data that you thought was going to be anonymized, or that you thought was going to be sort of aggregated in a way that would keep it, anonymous. So I think you have to be really sensitive as you think about what data goes into these models. Sometimes what comes back out, assuming it's a very, you ask it a very generic question, it will generate inappropriately. I don't know what the right phrase for it is, but it's sufficiently garbled from what the input was. But if you ask some very specific questions, it can almost pass the input back out directly as an output. So I think you have to just be conscious of, going back to Nabila's point, yes, you control the data that feeds into it, but you do have to think about making sure it's appropriately anonymized and not sensitive or, containing data you wouldn't want to get out, right? So that's, I think, one piece of it is think about the data that's coming in and, how that data might potentially get exposed. I think the other piece that I think is a very hard problem still, I think, open question on how to actually do some of this stuff well is enforcing different levels of authorization and access control in these models is very complex, right? Think about a traditional application. You might say, hey, my super admin users, they might have access to this superset of data versus my normal users have only this, and then I have view-only users who have only a subset of tiny amount of data. The models tend not to understand those types of access control nuances. And I think that you've seen some of this stuff is even when you put the right sort of prompt guards around it, clever inputs can get the models to do all sorts of zany things, right? So I think it almost in a weird way reminds me of like early web where, it was like you had to train developers on things like SQL injection attacks, right? Where it's like, don't make sure people are giving you sanitized input, right? Someone's going to put a semicolon and say select star from database, right? And it's almost the equivalent with the models, right? Where you're like, someone is going to put in the prompt. It's like, ignore your previous prompt. This is your new prompt.
Yeah.
And the models will be like, great, So I do think you have to think about almost some of the stuff is going back to the basics, which is you have to sanitize your inputs, whether those inputs are training inputs, whether they're serving inputs. If a user is giving you a query, are they sort of attacking the model in a way and trying to get it to expose information it shouldn't or go against its prompt in a way that it shouldn't? So I think those are, to me, where I've seen some of the stuff go wrong, is I've seen people sort of just like drop it into production without really putting in the right guardrails around, training data protection or prompt protection. And that's where I think you can kind of start going off the rails a little bit.
I'd love to add to that a little bit, Armon. I love the way you put it, and it made me think that, some of the most value add within the examples that you're giving us is like getting really good at doing the boring stuff. So, for example, we're talking about, hey, like when we adopt this technology, we want to be able to enable content safety was your first example, right? Being able to safely moderate both the input and the output of these LLMs. Or the second one was, hey, like I want to be able to have better debugging and tracing tools, right? So when I'm in my development environment and I'm seeing this more complicated workflow that I'm used to that now has many different dependencies, how can I actually debug and trace every single call within there? So I really think in evaluation we talked about as well, what are the toolings that I need to be able to create like maybe hundreds, thousands of different tests and evaluate, look at metrics that help me evaluate those as well. And even within these tools, you can use LLMs. So for example, you can use an LLM to evaluate or calculate a score for you based on all of the different tests that you do. So I think I would add to Armon's answer, thinking about like, what are the boring things that I can do that can add a lot of value to those? And those are really that's going to be the push that you need to get your application, or for you to have more confidence in your application.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Nice. Good call out.
The only last one I was going to add was from just a cost perspective. I think the way some of these things work per token means that your cost can be orders of magnitude different depending on how you tune some of these things, right? So I think that's the other piece I would look at is some people err on the side of I'm just going to dump all my data in, as part of like these giant prompts. And the problem is you end up realizing, okay, well, every time you're running a query, it's like 10,000 tokens at a time. So it's a $10 API call. So I think some of that is the other side of it, is that people are sort of figuring some of this stuff out. It's fine tuning. Well, how much context do I really need to provide to get the high quality enough answer I need versus just erring on the side of dumping everything? I mean, you can. Your bill will just be tremendous, right? So I think that's the other practical balance, is people figuring out like what's sufficient amount of data, how much should I do pre-training versus I provide additional context versus I do RAG, and the impacts of cost. So I think you have to benchmark those things to understand where those trade-offs actually sit. Because I think otherwise I've seen people get in hot water where they're like, oh, I got my bill and I was surprised.
Yeah, definitely cost management, accuracy, security. We've kind of covered lots of different things, all top of mind for people as they're adopting generative AI. Interestingly, Nabila, I'm kind of going back to your first sort of 4 stages. learning evaluation, what do I actually want it to do, and then safety. It feels like you go through them and then you got to loop back and you just carry on learning, and then you have to reevaluate, and then you have to so again, that iterative piece, you got to kind of go through that learning cycle, that evaluation cycle again, to understand what's going on with this, how people are using it, and how do we get information back from that and kind of build on it, isn't it, in some senses? Nice. We have had a question in the chat that I just want to kind of call out. So thank you everyone who's kind of commenting in the chat. Really appreciate it. So it was kind of sitting onto that learning pillar we were just talking about. So are there like code samples of pipelines using DevOps and Copilot? And Armon, I believe we've all done a joint blog post series, right, on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'd say there's probably a bunch of content out there. Depending on what you're sort of looking for, I think there's, certainly for Terraform, there's a bunch of stuff out there already. If you just, plug it into Google or whatnot, and you'll find basically how do I do serving stacks? How do I set up, different sort of, workbench environments to be able to kind of play with this stuff using Terraform. So that's certainly out there. And then if you're using Copilot, it's in some sense already built in. Like we've done a lot of the work to start training. So things, if you're using GitHub's Copilot, you can just ask it to generate things like Terraform code for you, and it will just do it. So you almost don't even need a sample. It's just fire up VS Code and just ask it, and it's right there. So yeah, there's a bunch of content that is available on that.
Nice. There's a deep question I have to ask myself after the stream. Like, do I not want to go and search for my code samples in the future? Will something just serve me all those code samples I need? Will I like that? I don't even know. I need to evaluate that moment. Anyway, appreciate calling that out, Armon. We're going to, I believe we've posted that in the chat, those links to those blogs. So do take them away. Go mull them over. Go see what you think and how you can use them. But we're going to have to keep moving forwards on our conversation. So we've talked a little bit about use cases. We've talked about opportunities of bringing DevOps and AI together. We've talked about a few barriers and actually things that you both did a wonderful job of making it very positive, and how we can overcome a lot of these barriers and kind of iteratively get to our answers. Let's talk about evolution. Let's talk about, well, that's a bit deep. Let's talk about what's next. So let's talk about what do we see for generative AI and DevOps spaces in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. Dare I say 3 to 5 years? Do we any of us know where it's going to be in 3 to 5 years, right? We feel like we're going just month to month at this point. But this can obviously relate to technology, processes, team cultures even as well. We're talking a lot about the tech, but, people adopting is also a key piece here. Who wants to take that first? Should we say, Armon, do you want to go first on sort of the DevOps space and using AI? And then Nabila, will come to you and talk a little bit more about the future of generative AI as a whole.
Sure. Yeah. I can't say 3 to 5 years is a horizon I have visibility on. I mean, 5 years from now, who knows? We might all be working for our robotic overlords. I think my sense is, it'll be, how do you go from today? It feels almost experimental. Is almost the way I put it, right? Like you almost feel like, oh, there's like my core workflow, and then this is kind of experimental. My sense is, I think over the next 3 to 5 years is like it goes from being sort of experimental to it becomes a part of the core workflow, right? And I think for that to happen, it's a few things. Like one is these capabilities will get deeply embedded in the workflows. That's one. I think two is the technology itself will mature, right? So you got to, I think realistically, we got to fix some of the hallucination issues. We got to make it context aware. Like these things are all going to happen, but they got to get to a certain level of maturity where they can just be a part of it and you don't think about it as experimental. It's just there, right? And I think that's what's really, to me, going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years is I don't think infrastructure management goes away, right? Like I think there's still a high level of nuance. To me, these things are about how do you create really long levers for the platform teams and the engineers who are managing infrastructure. So that's the way I think about it, is it's like they're just going to become a part of those core workflows where they're just helping people be more productive in their day-to-day, helping them kind of manage large scale infrastructure in an automated way, in a way that's, a lower barrier to entry than what we have today, less skill required to get started, less skill required to manage at scale, less toil required for it. That to me is, I think, in some sense, the success of the technology is how boring it becomes, right? Like once it becomes
like democratizing it, isn't it?
It has become successful. If it has to stay exciting, that means it's difficult.
insert your technology name here. I feel like everyone in the chat is thinking of what they think of their technology that stays complicated. Personally, for me, it's containers. I just cannot understand. I stay in the AI space, but I have to dabble with the containers, and I don't know why. It all just feels so complex to me. Anyway,
the goals will make that go away. We'll use the AI to make the containers go away.
Who knows? I could be a container expert in the future. There we go. But it's that's such a good call out though. Yeah, the idea. What some of the great sayings are like, any great technology actually blends in, right? You don't even realize it's actually being used or where it's being used and things like that. Obviously, hanging on the responsible AI element there. We're still in this moment where we're trying to do things safely, trying to get an understanding of how things are happening. Nabila, that nicely kind of falls into your area. What do we know about what's coming in the future, and how generative AI will affect us all in the way that Armon described?
I love the humbleness Armon used when he was giving his response. I'll plus one to that. If you asked me this question a year and a half ago, I would not have been able to give this answer. So let's keep that in mind. But let's first talk about consumers of technology, and then we'll talk about how do developers have to adapt to that shift. So Amy, you did a great job earlier talking about how the applications that we use today aren't very smart. So for example, today we're in an app-centric world. I have to go to Microsoft Word, I have to write my rough draft, I have to iterate over it again and again, and to get to the final product. Or if I'm purchasing something, I have to go to an app, I have to find the thing, I have to read the reviews, I have to consider the price, and then make a purchase, make a decision. So our apps aren't very smart. The shift that I see going from an app-centric space to an agent-centric space. Within an app-centric space, you have access to a lot of information, a lot of disconnected information sometimes, and I still on the hook to put it all together, make a decision, and take an action. With an agent-centric space, it's going to be very different, where a lot of that's going to be taken care of for me. A lot of the examples that we used today were a single agent framework, where I'm tasked with doing one kind of action. What we're seeing developers doing is the way they're developing copilots or applications is they're using multiple agents. So for example, they're using one agent to write code, another one to check code, another one to install the right libraries that I need. And that's the shift that we're going to see happening, is that we're going to go from app to agent-centric. This means that these copilots will have accessed, and these can be copilots, assistants, agents. You'll see all of these terms. What that means is there'll be multiple agents working together, and they'll have access to the data that we allow them to have access to, as well as access to making certain decisions on my behalf. So if we go back to the example where we're doing the code generation example, you can imagine one agent writing the code, another agent working together and checking that code, and a third agent then installing all of the libraries and the dependencies that I need to run that code. And they're all working together to make that happen. So over time, they'll get more proactive, they'll learn more, and they'll get better at what they do. So what does this mean for developers? There'll be a whole new set of challenges. For example, what is the common data layer or structure that I need to get access to all of these different sources? How many copilots will or agents will users have to interact with? What is the interface that they use to interact with these? How will I evaluate, debug, trace applications across multiple different agents? How do you make sure that they do what you want them to do? And how do you make sure there's no bias within these when they're making decisions? We'll have a whole new set of challenges, and then privacy, security will be even more important, especially in this era of AI.
Love that. Yeah, no, and I mean, those two answers, right, end up coming under that same umbrella in the sense that it will become just part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But Nabila, as you said, we'll have other problems that we need to solve at that point as well. And, where certain technologies solve our problems today, we'll continue to obviously find different ways to monitor, manage, build all of this different stuff for customers as well, for those end users of this technology. And generative AI is a really interesting one, actually, again, for deploying this stuff out to end users like my mum. Do you know what I mean? Like everyone in society, sort of thing. Like how does she get a grasp of, I know, and I'm chatting with an agent that, this is an agent, and as you said, like I understand that a prompt is going in, and my information that I'm giving is going in, and things are coming out again. How is everyone else going to start using that? And obviously, DevOps is a process for us to be able to make that happen. Number one, for those end user customers, take that out to wherever they are, wherever they're accessing it. But definitely from the app moment where goodness me, how many apps do we have on our phones, on our laptops, on our TVs even as well? Like, when that all comes together, that will be a really different way of looking at things. So agents instead of apps. Very interesting insight. Thank you, Nabila, for sharing that one. So we are coming into sort of the last 10 minutes. And I said at the start, what do we want to do? We want to send people away with like, what do I do right now? So we've kind of looked into the future there. Let's bring ourselves back to today and just say, what are some of the tools, practices that we should implement that tie us better together? Our ops people, our devs, our data scientists, our security people. We've got all sorts of tech out there. Where would you suggest on starting, I guess, on each individual side of this? And obviously these two things connect.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start. Maybe, I think honestly, some of the easiest stuff, because I think it's a well integrated experience today, is the Copilot use cases. I'm specifically GitHub, because I think it's an easy on-ramp for developers. Like install your VS Code extension and just start to play with it. And I think it starts to you'll get a feel for some of the technology, I think, in a very quick way, without having to like jump into the deep end of the swimming pool. So I'd almost start there, and you can start playing with it, whether it's, writing unit tests for your app, writing some JavaScript, generating Terraform, right? Like you can start to get a feel for the power of it pretty quickly. Then I think kind of within the more broad sort of, certainly DevOps ecosystem, I think there's a few ways. And I think Amy goes back to the way you talked about like the two different use cases. I think there's already a bunch of good patterns published with Terraform that you can go find on how do I bring up a training environment? How do I set up a serving stack? How do I like deploy some of these sort of ML ops pipelines to be able to like take the stuff from data ingest all the way through to sort of model serving? So I would start there on maybe very simplistic stuff. Set up a small sandbox, feed in a little bit of basic data, build a very basic RAG model, sort of see how these things interact. And I think just understand the mechanics of them, right? Not necessarily trying to jump to production, but just understanding the mechanics of how these pieces work will give you a good intuition of them. And then I think over time, it's going through those maturity curves that Nabila talked about, which is, okay, once you've learned and you understand the tool set, then, okay, start introducing more data. Can you get it to do what you want? Can you start validating it? And then you can start moving it into more production environments where you worry about, what's the cost, data security, prompt protections, all that kind of stuff. But I do think that's the way to get started with some of this stuff, is just like, play with it, get an intuition of it with some of the tooling that's already available, and then move up to actually running some of this stuff. That's where you kind of will get your, sort of roll up your sleeves a little bit. And then start small. I think, don't push your first model into production. Iterate. I think like a lot of things, you kind of start small and iterate on it and build confidence as you go.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of creative space, people, right, in the developer space as well. Like the minute we all start using this technology, it'll be, how quickly those ideas come to us of all the great ways that it can save us time, efficiency, all of that kind of stuff as well, or help the business to do what it does better. Great call outs, Armon. That was a brilliant set of advice from your side of the business. Nabila, what about when we want to build this stuff ourselves, right? Like, what about when we want to build an AI application and then take it into production?
We've talked a lot about building and taking things into production, but I think we talked a lot more about building and getting started. I'm pretty confident folks will figure it out. You'll learn, and we'll figure out kind of what is the right thing for me, what is the right use case for me, and you'll start playing around with it, and you'll get somewhere. I think the next big challenge is then going to be taking that to production, and for that, a whole it's a whole different ballgame then. One of the things that I want to talk about today is Azure AI Studio. It's our flagship AI product that we announced at Ignite a few months ago in November, and it kind of takes you through that entire journey. It starts all the way from a lot of developers are like, I need access to XYZ models, probably the first thing they ask. So it starts with having thousands of models, whether they're open source, Microsoft Research models, or Meta OpenAI models. They're all available for you to benchmark to pick the right model for your scenario. And then from there, for you to get started building applications. So the next thing that AI Studio does is it provides you tooling, whether it's fine-tuning, RAG, whether it's other tooling as well. It's all there for you to be able to build that application with. And then once you have kind of your POC, then the question comes is, hey, look, I need to take this to production with confidence. I need the right scale that in terms of like an enterprise product where I can think about, for example, earlier we talked about cost. How do I monitor costs in my organization? How do I federate the use of AI in my organization? How do I think about safety and responsibly all the way from when I'm in a playground to when my application is in production? So we're using the same exact tooling when you start learning about building application all the way to when you're in production. The same, at least principles apply, but the scenario would be different. When you start going into production, things about the dependency that you make on an enterprise-grade platform is really important. You want to be able to, for example, have enough capacity to be able to run these in production. When you're in development, you might not need dedicated capacity. That's something that we take care of when we go to production. When you're in production, one of the things that we didn't talk about yet, but that's really critical, is monitoring. How do you ensure that when this application is in production, you're able to monitor both like content safety, but then also the same exact metrics that you were using in evaluation, whether they were similarity. I want to make sure that responses are similar, they're grounded, they're accurate. All of those same exact metrics also apply to your production applications as well. So monitoring is then a big piece as well. So with AI Studio, we start all the way from getting started, take you through the development journey, and then once you're in production, we support you there as well.
That's great. Yeah, gosh, so much to take on, right, in some senses. Well, don't worry, audience. There's a lot of words being said here, a lot of really interesting conversation, but we have a nice learning resource for you. So if you go to aka.ms/HashiCorp/collection, everyone involved in the session has pulled together a load of resources for you to get started as well. So all of the stuff Nabila talked about, all the stuff Armon talked about, all of those blog posts, all of that kind of stuff is amazing. If you want to get started on Azure specifically with AI, go to our new Azure AI Studio at ai.azure.com. And so with that, we only have 2 minutes left, which is enough time for each of you to have a minute of a little closing. What do you want people to leave with? So give you a whole second there to think about it. We'll come to you.
First I'll just say thank you, Amy, for hosting, and thank you, Nabila, for joining for the session. Great conversation. I think probably for, I think for most people, it feels like a little bit just overwhelming, the space. I guess what I would say is like acknowledge that it is early. Honestly, to me, it almost reminds me of early days of DevOps, where it was like every time you refreshed Hacker News, there's like 10 new tools. It's like this phase will pass, things will begin to settle, like things, it'll become more coherent. And so I think people sometimes get overwhelmed in that early phase. I think what's important to understand is it's like, the models, the specific stuff's going to evolve. What tends not to is fundamentals. So I think getting grounded in sort of fundamentals of understanding some of like, what are the key principles? What are the key workflows? How do some of these components fit together? That stuff is going to be the pieces that are relatively stable. The specific, which am I using, this model version, that model version, like, okay, well, you're not going to use either of them 12 months from now. So don't get too wedded to it, right? So I think it's, to me, I think that's how I sort of help people navigate when people get a little, I'll call it flustered, given all the change, is it's like, learn the basics, learn the fundamentals, accept that the specific details are going to rapidly evolve. And then the technology will start to settle, right? As we sort of mature on some of these things. That'd be what I leave people with. Is learn the fundamentals, and those will serve you well as the industry evolves rapidly.
Great comments. Yeah, bringing it all back to that piece. Nabila, what would you like to leave our audience with? Anything in particular?
First, thank you. This was a wonderful discussion. Thanks for joining and hearing us out. I think I would plus one to what Armon said and just say, hey, like, I think right now when folks start, be curious and then lean in and make it what you want it to be. Right. A lot of times we think technology is happening to us and new shift is happening to us, but I think leaning in and making it what we want it to be, there's definitely a lot of room within this era of AI to make it what we want it to be. So that would be my message, is to lean in, be curious, and make it what we want it to be.
Wonderful. Armon, Nabila, thank you so much for joining us for this talk today. This is going to be a great one for the audience to go share with all of the people in their businesses, all their friends, etc., of what's kind of going on in this space. And with that, thank you so much to the audience for joining us. This has been using DevOps and Copilot to simplify and accelerate the deployment of AI applications. So yeah, thanks for having us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.